Welcome, everyone. I have my longtime associate and friend, Lama Justin von Budjoss. How do we say your last name? Budjoss,
That was
correct?
good. That was great. Yeah.
And I would call this the Buddhist Medicine and Yoga podcast. But really, it's about close, honest discussions, getting down to the nitty gritty. So I won't belabor so much. I want to share that uh, Lama Justin is a Buddhist chaplain and an educator and a Dharma teacher. And I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about what is, or I should preface actually, for those that are listening, today's conversation may begin to discuss sensitive topics related to trauma-informed caregiving and other issues around bereavement and loss. So I wanted to give this opportunity, if some of the material may be potentially sensitive, to choose to pause for a moment or revisit it another time. But just to let you know, we'll be delving into more personal, sensitive topics around Buddhist practice and caregiving. So, welcome, Lama Justin. I want to not beat around the bush. Life is so short. It's something that we learned about in the last few years. It became so underscored and poignant. And I wanted to look at the topic of spiritual caregiving as a broader topic, over and above just Buddhist chaplaincy. But if you could share with us a little bit about what notions of spiritual care might be and how they relate to more professional work in Buddhist chaplaincy, perhaps in hospice, hospital-based care, or correctional environments. What's the difference between this larger need for spiritual care in our society and then the work of Buddhist chaplaincy?
Yeah, great. Thanks, James. It's wonderful to be here with you and with everybody. Um, well, I think, what's interesting is that there is it's kind of the meeting of two worlds, right? And especially within the context of Vajrayana Buddhism, there seems to be a very long, I should say, practice of engaging the lay population, like I guess you could say the laity, um, providing all sorts of ritual support, emotional support, and whatnot throughout the Tibetan plateau, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. So you have, especially, for example, like in Nakba communities where it's not uncommon for people to go from home to home doing pujas and providing support for people in a traditional kind of Buddhist way. And I had a teacher in Sikkim who basically in his advanced age did this. He just basically traveled all around Sikkim providing this kind of care. Um, and the kind of training one needs for this is, typical spiritual slash religious training. And then when we look at what is prevalent here, or really, the system here is there's in one way of speaking, there's a somewhat regulated relationship to spiritual care in hospital settings, hospice settings, and correctional settings. Hospital settings tend to have the most defined kind of strictures around the basic training that's needed, and then a little bit less so sometimes with hospice, and still, about 50-50 is this requirement there within corrections for clinical pastoral education. So this has this kind of uh, clinical piece around being a caregiver. So CPE is kind of the gold standard if one wants to be able to kind of bring their spiritual caregiving desires, and especially with respect to becoming perhaps a professional chaplain or something along those lines. Um, and there can be, I mean, there's an inconsistency in some respect, where I think there are a lot of great people who would be able to become chaplains very easily. They have all the Buddhist training, they have all the ritual training, they have all the stuff. They just need to kind of get into the structure, within our culture. Um, That being said, like clinical pastoral education is a really rich and dynamic experience. It actually, most divinity schools require that the students who graduate need to do 1 unit of clinical spiritual education. And one of the reasons why is because you walk into, I mean, imagine walking into the hospital room of somebody who suffers from tuberculosis and you don't know anything about tuberculosis. And then you introduce yourself as a spiritual caregiver for this floor. And then you learn how to work with people who are going through experiences, perhaps that experience that you've never gone through. So it causes you to have to check a lot of your blind spots, to look at cultural differences, power differentials, assumptions, right? Assuming that going to be able to speak to you and you will understand what it is that I'm saying, even spiritually. I've seen some Buddhist chaplains very, very, very passionate about, maybe you could say their intent, but they're unable to hear that the other person can't hear the words, right? They don't, perhaps they don't know the terminology, or somebody keeps talking about protectors, it will freak freak the patient out. So there's this, what it is really is, I mean, I imagine kind of similar in traditional medicine settings, right? Where you can have a whole host of quote unquote indigenous knowledge around what to do, but then pulling it into the Western cultural milieu requires some tempering and working with the structures that are here.
Absolutely. Can I break this down a little bit
Yeah.
for different listeners? So one, which I'd love to get to, are different roles between in culture for Buddhist ministry or pastoral care. For example, there was an article I was reading by Lama Willa Miller, and she was saying, I started to get into this chaplaincy work, and what I quickly saw, my traditional roles of a teacher, transmission, instruction, holding practice. But when it came to actual teaching and pastoral care, a whole other set of skills, relational skills, ways of being present, really looking at our intention and also empathy and compassion. They came into play, largely the social relational skills. So it sounds like we're listening to traditional roles, for example, of a nakpa, priest or yogin, in care, and also our medical tradition focuses on engaged care. But then there are basic aspects of caregiving that we can cultivate, both professionally and interpersonally. Can we go there actually before moving into the traditional?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
kind of mentioned, yeah, you mentioned the narrative and the personal context, and I know in some coursework you'll be sharing, you seem to pinpoint the importance of understanding identity, social location, and the narrative context. Would you say anything about that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, um, what is essential and all we need to do, I mean, this is you could say it's kind of like a very informal form of Tonglen. Imagine being sick and somebody barreling in to the room and not particularly self-aware of their impact, and they're the spiritual caregiver and they're maybe in a rush, right? And we've been in these situations where we can feel like, oh, this person doesn't understand me, this person is moving into this, occupying this space maybe in an inappropriate way or a threatening way or a completely ignorant way, um, or might misgender me, or all of these kinds of things, right? So what these, or not share, I mean, the biggest thing is a difference in faith too, because um roughly at best 3% of the United States is Buddhist, and maybe a quarter of that number is Vajrayana, practicing Buddhist. So it also means being able to kind of temper your relationship to being a spiritual caregiver for somebody who does not share the same values, spiritual values, or even concept around, theological formation or anything like this. So there are certain outcomes that are all trainees in clinical pastoral education are meant to master, right? So, for example, like being aware of power dynamics around gender is one, but learning how to be a non-judgmental um, presence. Deep listening. Um, not only because of the data you're taking in about somebody's condition, but being able to listen to aspects of narrative that might be hard to hear, right? Or that it might not even be real, right? Half of my clinical training was on psychiatric floors in hospitals in Manhattan. And I worked a lot with people who suffered from schizoaffective disorder. And there, it's like what would be shared in terms of, verbal narrative to me was one thing. And obviously it's not the place for me to correct, people who are saying, I gave birth to Jesus, all this kind of stuff. So being able to listen very deeply and to try to be able to listen to what else is being communicated, right? So you're having to kind of get out of your own way through the mastery of these different outcomes. And what was really fascinating for me while going through CPE was also watching clergy of other faith traditions. So Protestant chaplains, Muslim chaplains, Jewish chaplains, Catholic chaplains, all learning how to be able to do this themselves. Because, in this quote you read by Lama Willa, there's this removal in clinical pastoral education of the gravity of one's position as a person of faith, right? So it's as if, you'll go in there with all of your traditional training, and that's not, you're supposed to actually kind of put that identity aside and then go out onto your floors, right? And so you have to learn how to be able to occupy space, oftentimes in a much more creative way, rather than holding on to this kind of the gravity of the religious power, which is really important for people who are, for example, Dharma teachers or priests or imams or rabbis, to have this experience of what their affect is like when they just ride on the coattails of their religious position versus kind of going in almost like a spiritual spy, first to assess, right, what are the concerns that this person has right now, and then to be able to come in and provide support.
There's a way that you allow space for another's religious affinities,
Oh, absolutely.
their identity, their own meaning to emerge. So it seems like there's some ways that traditional Buddhist practice lends to qualities of listening,
Yeah.
of dealing with uncertainty, not grasping. But there are certain discipline specific things that you're almost reimagining practice as you go along. That's something I perhaps observe in your
Mhm.
adaptation of practice and thought. Yeah, is
Yeah.
there, please?
Yeah. Well, I think that, one of the most powerful, I mean, there are number of ways of kind of like, helping to kind of tailor the wisdom of the Vajrayana tradition into a way to be able to directly benefit caregiving. I think the two main ones for me personally are Mahamudra and Trekja. Um, Simply because, at one point, once once one's mind is settled, um, and stable enough to do the practice, uh, really settling into the direct experience of all of your senses, right? So just walking into, for example, just walking into a hospital room and noticing all the sounds, right? Including any sound perhaps coming from the patient. But is this a peaceful place? Is this an agitating place, right? Really kind of feeling in with that sense. Then there's all the visual data, in terms of facial expression, body language, how the things are arranged around the bed, the room itself, temperature, right? So all sensation, smells, right? And sitting quietly and a little slowly, or learning to do this kind of on the fly while walking, right? But really kind of take in, the baseline experience that's happening, right? And so both Mahamudra and Trekcha are really nice kind of bedfellows, so to speak, for this kind of practice, because they require the practitioner in a very loose and relaxed way to settle into the direct experience of what's happening in the moment, right? And so this kind of creates a really strong foundation of kind of harmonization, the ability to harmonize with another person's kind of mode of being in that moment. So if it's, then you begin to kind of really like can develop maybe a working knowledge base of, and maybe also kind of like the spiritual emotional muscles of being able to go to a place of deep grief with somebody, or sudden violent change, car accident or something like this, or somebody recovering from an assault of some kind, um, or confusion, right? I covered a lot of patients at Memorial Sloan Kettering when I worked in both corrections and hospice, because we got some hospice beds at MSK. And so in some cases where somebody might have a cancer that is spreading, but they're still trying to determine, there's no treatment, right? They deal with a lot of experimental cancers there, right? So that kind of uncertainty of, I know the prognosis is not good, but nobody even knows what we can do, so that's that kind of deflation. And then of course all the good things too, right? All the people who are like, they're at peace with being at the end of life or a sudden change. I once rushed across Brooklyn. Somebody told me there was an emergency happening at a hospital, at Brookdale Hospital. Drove out, and a correction officer had just given birth, and she was excited. And so it was a lovely thing to I thought I was going to be attending to a much more tragic thing. But really using all of these things, even while driving. So with corrections, with both hospice and corrections, there's a lot of driving, going all over the city. So even just, while driving, right, checking in on what is going on in my body, for example. Like I did a lot of emergency response for New York City Department of Correction, and most of it happened at night. So I'd get a call 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, and whenever anybody would called me, I always knew I'd have to get up and go. So start to do that, take down all the information around where I was supposed to go. As I'd walk downstairs to hop into my vehicle, I would begin to check in to notice what's going on with my body. What's my thought activity like? Right? How spacious am I? Sometimes, and the caregiver doesn't always have this opportunity to kind of pick and choose what they're responding to. There could be something that was very resonant of a deeply painful experience for myself. So if I find out that somebody's providing me information on the phone about the nature of the crisis, and hits a little too close to home, then listening to that, how much is my own story coming in, and perhaps creating a different narrative than what's really happening. So all of these, it's not a perfect set of standards, but it's pretty good, and I guess you could say that the rest, maybe even just like, your acupuncture practice, you learn all the stuff that you should know, but then over the course of a career, you fill in gaps through experiential knowledge.
Let's go towards some of these gaps, really
Yeah.
embodied, relational. So vulnerability.
Mhm.
I think sometimes when we're just meeting someone new and maybe in a crisis situation or a time of uncertainty, religious beliefs aside, one of the things that's immediate that establishes trust, connection, rapport is vulnerability or humanness. Are there ways that you see that Buddhist practice and our own vulnerability, getting into our own vulnerability through practice, is helpful for caregiving or
Oh,
chaplaincy?
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there are a couple. One practice that I think is incredible at this is Rushan, for example, like taking Rushan. So this practice, I mean, like in a very kind of abbreviated way, just imagining that, at the level of your brow is the god's realm, the level of the throat is the demigod's realm, the level of the heart is the human realm, the navel is the animal realm, your genitals or secret place is the hungry ghost realm, and the bottoms of your feet are the cold and hot hells. And even, there's specific meditations around, doing this, but even if you begin to just let yourself feel into, from the moment we woke up this morning till now, all of the different places I've been active, right? So just in a very kind of titrated down version of Rushan. What was my God realm? How many times have I been a God even today, or a hell being, or a hungry ghost, like craving after things? So this is really powerful. And I taught this to a group of students at Union Theological Seminary this past fall within the context of chaplaincy, because so Trekcha and this, and also Vajra chanting or Vajra recitation as a means of being able to kind of slow down, right, and come back to one's senses. But so all the practice of Rushan allows us to be able to connect to our habituation with respect to ignorance and desire and hot emotions, cold emotions. I tend to have always interpreted as lack of energy, depression, this kind of very frozen kind of experience. And so also it's like it's actually a very interesting self-assessment tool as well, to be able to kind of move through the day, being able to just very honestly, without judgment, say, oh, I'm like this right now. Oh, I just saw my supervisor. Now I'm turning into a bit of a hungry ghost, or a demigod. And then all of these things gives us, when we're aware of them, all of these are able to help us to understand what we're bringing into the room, as if, we're kind of bringing a ghost into the room. Um, but it also allows us to be able to help almost use it as an assessment tool for where other people are in the moment too, to better understand, like, oh, this person really feels to me in my private assessment like they are occupying a hot hell today, or right now is a cold hell, depressive experience, or, some other thing. And then, just recently, like outside of chaplaincy, I was teaching a chapter from Karma Chugme's Union of Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And in this section on enhancement practices, he names Tonglen, right? And this Tonglen and things like Chenrezi practice are just such powerful ways of, again, kind of keeping us compassionately oriented, right? Around, basically oriented around the experiences of others first. And that's important too, because as anybody who's ever worked in any kind of clinical setting can know, the inspiration behind why you may have become trained is pure. But over the course of a day, when you have, tight time slots and all this kind of stuff, it's easy to kind of come off in a accidental, non-compassionate kind of way. And so having this attunement to, the low energy of person X in their bed, who might it might require me to be here longer in order to really listen to what they have to say and kind of match their energy. The Tonglen can be very helpful in this way. And Chenrezig practice as well, just from the standpoint of keeping one's eyes open to the experiences of other people, as opposed to problem solving. Problem solving seems to take us out of relationship and we're future oriented, right? We need to kind of start with, what is happening right here first, and then, allow ourselves to get as sensitive as possible. But these practices, Mahamudra, Trekja, Tonglen, Chenrezig practice, Tara practice, obviously, Medicine Buddha, yeah. Oh, and then Che, from the standpoint of view, right? So going to places that scare us, right? Let me not hold back, One of the things, so during COVID, New York City's Potter's Field, or Hart Island at that time, was run by New York City Department of Correction, and I was the head chaplain for New York City Department of Correction and executive director for wellness there. And City Hall asked if I wanted to bless the bodies that were being brought onto Hart Island, at that time mainly of COVID dead. And I got really excited at the prospect, but it's heavy, like it's really hard. So at that time, and I still do this every week. There's, one to two truck loads of bodies, 26 bodies usually in a truck, or sometimes a truck of baby bodies. And on the baby ones are hard because I've got, young kids still. But bringing this ethos of Che to this kind of work, of I'm aware of my discomfort, I'm aware of the heaviness of this, and I'm going to practice through this and with this. And we could do that with every kind of emotion. So really, like, the more we settle into kind of a way of blending awareness or rigpa into caregiving, that's when there becomes this lack of separation between outer practice and inner practice. It really, almost like Tai Chi, like the level of awareness and connectedness that is possible doesn't let us say anymore, well, that's just work, right? No, this is Dharma practice. Everything, right? It could be being a yoga teacher, it could be being an acupuncturist, or even making herbs, right? Preparing herbs, like every single thing, every aspect of spiritual caregiving. If we bring Rigpa to it, it's this perfect union of benefit for self and other.
When we work with this view, how do we integrate virtues of self-care and even applying view and method to circumstances? How do you metabolize experience in such a way that as a care provider, caregiver, this notion of resilience, flourishing, and self-care? So you've spoken about really embodied descriptions of how to be in suffering or shared space with another, but the residue, the cost of caring, how do you also digest and metabolize your experience so that the ecology is
Yeah, well, I mean, personal spiritual practice is kind of, one of the main things. So, much like an artist, or say a musician, um, needs to stay on kind of point with their music, right? They need to practice scales and do, kind of maintain um their skill set. And as a chaplain, I mean, this was something that I kind of recognized pretty quickly. It was, I need to be rooted in my practice, in a way that feels that it keeps me So, I do like the term resilient. And so this has caused me to have to kind of understand how to use or understand Dharma as a way of, deepening view, definitely, but also kind of plugging into source. Which I think, again, Mahamudra and Dzogchen offer this very nice, you could say it's like a lighter lift to be able to settle into that kind of state through those practices. But deity yoga is really, really helpful. Chus helpful. Protector practices are helpful. So all of this on a Dharma practice side. Um, I worked for New York City Department of Correction for 5.5 years, and I slept at best 5.5 hours every night for that time. So some aspects of perfect self-care, I think, is situational, right? You can either do it or you can't do it. And doing the best you can, I knew that, there was no way I could do that work by getting more sleep or with getting more sleep. So that part I wasn't able to care for, but practice, study, exercise is helpful, obviously, good diet, retreat, making time for retreat actually. And it's made me appreciate, for example, how in the Yutok Nintek, so many of the practices can be done in these kind of shorter style retreats, which you can kind of plug in a much more reasonable way than going away for a month or something like this. We're gonna say something?
No, just listening and maybe
Yeah.
to add something. So sometimes we are taught to apply a view. Like if we're really developing and we practice chud, we have that frame of reference. So sometimes when we encounter tragedy, or sometimes I would say deeply frozen states, embodied states of horror, of fear, and you as a care provider, someone being present through spiritual care, so to say, you can contact the unthinkable. You can also, when I hear you, rest with something in a deeply embodied way. But sometimes in medical, clinical care, caregiving, I've had to emphasize three things. One, not just this kind of view of wisdom, but like you mentioned, always checking in with the bodhicitta. So sometimes we would say that a compassion focused or compassion driven care that is not emphasizing just the trauma also, but they are resiliency flourishing models. And I've just seen different ways to negotiate one's role and them being less successful in provider population. So there's got to be the love and the juice, like the joy that has to be there in our lives. Maybe some physical, physiological regulation, like exercise, and then also a deep wisdom, like the way you're talking about abiding. So I was just wondering, a bigger topic is moral injury. So
Mhm.
in the context you've worked in, even more so, sometimes we contact institutional violence or things that are just unthinkable. And the view alone, it's a great medicine. But I'm looking at about this whole system of care
Mhm.
and how you deal with moral violence. You may not agree with the things, but you have to hold and be present. Anything about moral injury?
Oh yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I actually gave a talk at a conference in New Orleans on moral injury in corrections and within caregiving, as something to be addressed. Yeah, I mean, moral injury is I mean, we find moral injury even in Vajrayana Sanghas. So, moral injury is, right, the kind of, spiritual and psychological harm that's created when people are forced to do things that go against their moral principles. And by all means, I mean, I worked for New York State Department of Corrections, and I don't support the way it runs itself, or the politics behind corrections. However, the thing that I tried to do, I had a considerable amount of power. Like I was a direct report to the commissioner for the agency. And what I would always tell her in our meetings was that, I see myself not just as a chaplain for the people here, but a chaplain for, this agency. And she was very supportive of this. So one of my ways of trying to address my own moral injury was trying to help create mechanisms for other people's moral injury to be able to be supported. And yeah, I mean, there were plenty of times, like, there was I was actually at a kind of Sangha meeting in Oregon when there's a very high profile death of a trans person in custody um, occurred here in the city. And the imam who responded to the family, well, since I was traveling, um, kept misgendering the deceased to the family, right? Causing more and more harm, more and more harm, more and more harm. And I was then, after the fact, they called a politician called me, to complain about the quality of that instance of spiritual care. Uh, and I spoke to several different kinds of people within the agency, and you could see that they're all tone deaf to this as an issue, right? And this actually blew up and ended up becoming a big thing in the city. And moments like that, yeah, I would feel, this institution is so backward, so primitive, and feel uh, a heavy awareness of how important it would be to protect myself from falling into these kinds of environmental habitual patterns. And it's interesting because I was leading this retreat down in North Carolina recently and gave a Vajrayogini empowerment there. And when I do, I read through all of the different samaya, like the tantric samayas, right? And there's this one that applies directly to this kind of thing, which is two, actually, destroying the faith of another, right, is a infraction in terms of samayas. And then the other one is promising to avoid unskillful friends, right? And this is that kind of groupthink mentality where, within an organization like a law enforcement agency, if you're not careful, you begin to think like everybody else, right? Law enforcement tends to see the world in a very bifurcated way. It's usually black or not. I'm sorry, white or not white. And the views on gender are, male and female only, and anybody who ends up in custody must have done something wrong, and therefore they're not a good person, right? And so I've seen employees, including chaplains who have worked at DOC for over 20 years, just naturally becoming that way, right? So becoming that way, meaning just engaging in the kind of, the work or not lack of work of differentiating oneself and their views from others. And then the other being this lack of care around their power to destroy the faith of another person, you know. Um, and it's funny because, again, kind of going back to how important clinical pastoral education is, we see in some Dharma situations how some Dharma teachers would benefit from a greater awareness of their impact, around these things too. So it's fascinating, right? It's like both sides support the concept. The concept is really like, spot on, right? Um, to really be, I went to, there was a conference at Princeton in 2016 I went to on moral injury. Yeah, it's so fascinating, really understudied.
When I think about this phrase, reimagining practice, a lot of, even if when we take up mindfulness or shamatha, um, not understanding social causes of suffering is a real blind spot. There's implicit bias, internalized racism. This is just part of systemic institutional abuse, the violence that many experience day to day. Um, I think as a pivot, you work in these liminal spaces, even hospice. You've observed. I know sometimes you'll do perhaps rituals related to Bardo or the for the care of the deceased. How do traditional ritual practices inform how you are in your work, or do you adapt practices or do practices for yourself when you're navigating these social circumstances of care?
Mhm.
How do you bring in traditional ritual practice into care?
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, these are good questions. The answer around each one kind of depends a little bit on the context. So for example, on Hart Island, when I go there to bless the bodies, um, I do a lot of different things. I sometimes I practice Chi. There are a couple different protector prayers. I often recite the Heart Sutra. I there are a couple of psalms actually I'll recite as well. Um, Kind of spontaneous prayer based on kind of what I'm feeling from uh that moment, and mantra recitation at the end, kind of blessing all of the bodies. Because it's just myself and a truck and the people who do the burials, there's a lot of freedom, right? Especially with respect to bringing, uh, we could say like bringing the richness of the tradition, which, and the beautiful thing about, Vajrayana is it has such a rich relationship to channel ground imagery and things like this. So that's kind of hand in glove. Hospitals get a little, it's a little tricky, right? Because they're public spaces, and so they're public and they're shared. And not everybody shares the same faith tradition and views, so you always have to kind of consider the appropriateness of the situation. That being said, that when I was training as a chaplain, it was kind of really fascinating case of this young Tibetan couple. They had a son who had fallen and hit his head and had a subdural hematoma, and really weren't sure if he was going to live. And somebody, I guess the nurse, reached out to me to say they were Tibetan. I met with them, and they asked me to do Tara practice. They had no real kind of connection to Dharma practice on their own. And so I would come and do Tara practice in the morning and Medicine Buddha in the evening, at the beginning of my shift and end of the shift at the bedside. But that was just quiet sadhana, practice. Um, Poa, like, so I will do again, one doesn't typically meet. So Poa is interesting, right? Like, what do we do as Vajrayana people? If somebody dies, how appropriate, if a Baptist patient dies, how appropriate is it to do Poa for them, right? I would say it's appropriate if you have a conversation with the patient and they're like, oh wow, even though it's not my faith tradition, would you mind doing that for me? Like that sounds like, I need all the support I can get, kind of situation. I think that's fine, right? But it's interesting how like an unexamined relationship to some of these practices can be much like these practices we find within the Mormon faith, where they're baptizing people post death, right, into their faith tradition, right? So we're not trying to proselytize. Um, but I have done POA for people. I've worked with hospital staff and hospice staff to try to keep bodies from being touched for as long as possible, because this is really important, you know, in amongst a lot of different Buddhist uh, uh, lineage traditions. And sometimes, you know, sometimes if you have awareness of a Buddhist patient who is going to want this done, to begin to work with the social work team as early as possible so that they can begin to plan. So there is a lot that can be done. For my own practice, though, again, I really try and settle into this kind of open awareness or Rigpa state, um, because Mahamudra and Trekja, for for all practical purposes, is very transparent, right? So you can kind of put it over everything. Nobody knows you don't have any ritual items. So because intimacy is important in spiritual caregiving, and trust and intimacy. And we're not, especially in clinical settings, we're not just only the spiritual caregiver for the patient, we're for the staff as well. So if we can carry, I find, like, if I can carry myself in as open way, for there be fewer reasons for people to want to disconnect from me because they find something I'm doing is awkward or strange, I try to go with that. I try to be a blank slate as much as I can for the other person to kind of project whatever it is that they need onto me. Was that helpful?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of being this also mirror for others or ourselves, when we talk about moral injury, sometimes in medicine we have a ritual context. In Tantra, we have a religious confessional context, which means something. In your work in hospice or in seeing families deal with tragedy, um, and you see healing,
Mm-hmm.
anything that you would say about forgiveness? Because it's one of the things that I've seen in end of life care was that um, sometimes we take account of our lives. We also heal. There's a great opportunity when tragedy arises, any of this, is to heal old wounds. And I'm wondering if you have anything that you've observed around forgiveness.
Oh
Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Or even, yeah, within oneself, like how does it make you
sure.
more present as a care provider?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it's the so I was a kind of the go-to person for a lot of elderly uh, Italian Catholic and Irish Catholic men who needed a male presence to become very vulnerable with, right? To share. Oftentimes, and this is usually the social worker and nurses who would kind of sell me to these folks. They wanted somebody who was basically outside and could hold their secret, who was male, right? They needed to be able to give that. So, um, and this really became kind of a big thing where, in some cases, it was, a big kind of tough guy talking about the first time a girl ever held his hand, and how he still has the memory of the first girl who ever held his hand. And even though he's been married for 40 years, and he feels guilty about it, and he feels like he doesn't want to bring it to his wife because he doesn't want to hurt her feelings, but he needs to express how beautiful that is. And that fills him with love, and how important that is for him at the end of his life. This is a very kind of like tender sharing. And so the relationship between being able to access our tenderness becomes important, so you can actually understand the magnitude of what was just, offered to me, right? And how hard it was for this person to be able to verbalize, let alone have the causes and conditions to be able to do that, to come into play. And I'm fairly convinced that one of the best ways to be able to like have a relationship to that kind of tenderness is to have as much kind of open flow within oneself, right? Not holding on to things, right? Which means having a relationship to self-forgiveness, right? Having a relationship to being less defensive and reactive with others. And we're humans and we're not always going to get it right, and that's okay. But it's kind of like a two-way street, right? If we want people to feel like, I've had people, especially like you see this in corrections too, because in corrections on either side of the gate, people's defenses are really high, right? And so like, why do I need to share anything about myself with you, chaplain? So the person in custody can say that for valid reasons based on situation. The correction officer can say that for, equally valid reasons because of security. And I've had a lot of people tell me, like, I can't stop telling you all of my stuff, right? And they're like, I don't know why I feel so comfortable with you. And usually it's just because the only thing I've tried to be in these situations is just an open, you know, space that can hold, that can take, that you can tell me anything and you're not even going to be able to register so much that I'm shocked by it. If what you're, if you're scared of sharing intense things with me, not that my experience is lifeless, but there's a receptivity that allows this process that I think is also a very healthy human one to release. But if we don't understand that process for ourselves, it's going to be really hard for us to be able to support others in that too.
How
Um,
was that modeled for you in your training? I'm thinking about this one paraphrase where someone asked His Holiness the Dalai Lama, they said something to the effect of, what is the fastest way to achieve liberation in one life? Something like this.
Mhm.
And I think he stopped and teared and he said, forsaking liberation, may I come back over and over. And when I hear this, it brings to mind maybe some modeling in traditional Vajrayana practice that acquaints you with this kind of generosity of heart that kind of reflects this deeper resilience and caring. Sometimes we speak about it as Guru Yoga, but as you're speaking, I'm thinking, wow, if 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 I were ever to be present that way, some of the things that you're expressing feel like things we learn in Guru Yoga or modeled. Anything that
Yeah,
comes?
I mean, mandala offerings are a good example too. Like, I was just talking with somebody about their mandala offering practice, and I was reminding them that, you have an infinite amount that you're giving, right? So like we're very habituated to, I barely want to give you, I'll give you an eighth of this. Like I'm just so attached, we're attached to everything, we own everything, we're an independent, existing entity that is in opposition to everything else, right? So giving, like give, don't stop. Torma offerings, like give, like, getting into this, getting out of, it's interesting, some people have asked me, how do you protect your energy, like in these difficult places, like, Rikers or in hospice, or even, like I now have like easily bussed over 4,000 bodies, on Hard Island, since 2020. And people ask, well, how do you protect yourself there? And what I tell people is I protect myself by being open. Like there's nothing, if I start trying to protect this, right, I will always be fighting with everything that comes my way. So I'll just give and give and give. And this is what Lama Wangdu used to say all the time when he give the Cho empowerment. He'd tell the story about merchants coming back to Tibet from having, all the, selling all their wares in Nepal or India, and being terrified about bandits because they had all this gold. And, Lama Wangdu would say, the best way to kind of conquer your fear of this is to give all your gold away. So that you have nothing to hide, nothing to worry about being stolen. And in this way, right, learning to be able to kind of understand that you can't be tapped out. You can feel tapped out, but you can't truly be tapped out. Like we all have this, endless supply available to us. When our body feels tapped out, we should just rest, and then we'll come right back, right? The fact that our body is tired doesn't mean that we don't have it within us to be able to keep going with the work. So these kinds of adjustments, even if it's like a new thing, within 3 months of my, or 2.5 months of my being hired as the head chaplain for staff, a like newly minted officer was murdered, and I'd never ever responded to anything like this, right? And I remember I was, getting this call. It was gun violence. It was gang related. It was I had no experience with it, and it was super intense. And the other thing I learned from doing this work is you just keep going. Like, I can't, obviously I can't quit right now. So I'm going to show up. I don't know what's going to happen next, and that's okay. And using this, okay, I'm showing up here, I'm showing up here, I'm showing up here. And that's one of the reasons why, I stayed for as long as I did. It's a really, really, really hard work. But I really enjoyed the constancy of unbelievable things happening and then having to try to respond to them. And each one being, it's like each situation being a teacher, right? Literally, you and not just a teacher about myself, but a teacher about appearance, right? About people, about the human experience. And I think that this also provides a lot of benefit for my Dharma teaching as well, because the more you can understand the human condition and your own relationship to it, the better you're able to help others connect to it. Another good example would be, with death and dying practices. I've made, over a decade of being with death and dying something I've done in many different ways. And so that experience makes me able to be more reliable for others than if I never had it. So this is the other side of it, right? It's like every challenging experience we have makes us better. That's why there's this, this thing I just wrote for Tricycle online. It's got, iron sharpening iron, right? It's how like our difficult experiences in our practice, like they make it better, they make us sharper, they make us more resilient, they make us more able to harmonize, to find strength and fear and anxiety, terror, things like this.
So further for this last part, thank you very much. One, if there are other aspects of Adriana practice that you see directly translating over to caregiving, and then when we think about, I think this has kind of been answered, compassion fatigue,
Mm.
sometimes vicarious traumatization. So Buddhist practice helps us disidentify to some degree, because we look at that burnout as being about over identifying with the suffering of others. And I think I wanted to just, draw out any more somatic tips,
Yeah.
or we'll just go because it's clear how Buddhist wisdom and practice can translate. But I do wonder for our caregiver populations because I've seen it. I've seen it with doctors in my office, ER docs, any social workers, but we do get exhausted. We do, many feel like they carry some of the heebie-jeebies too. Like I would say, is
Yeah.
there no contamination
Yeah.
ritual, lighting of incense? But what I do see is that we carry oftentimes the unspoken stress and stories and traumas. And when we're holding so much space continually, having an ability to metabolize experience or rest, as you said, or practice with it. Is there anything else in any of those areas?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, and you're at the intersection of a lot of that, right? The this relationship between, I mean, we could even say health and taking care of our physicality, everything from the healing arts, so things like you find in So Rigpa or traditional Chinese medicine or anything like this. I mean, is vital in all of the therapies associated with these. And it doesn't have to just be Tibetan or Chinese, like taking care of this, right? Like in one manner of speaking, in the West at least, it seems like, yeah, it's funny, right? Like it seems as if a very educated class of people came to become interested in Buddhism at a initially, right? You find Buddhism, most people interact with it within a college kind of setting, university setting. And so it kind of creates this intellectual relationship to Buddhism, which can be, heady and all this kind of thing, but also sometimes promotes this idea that I can do this just through meditation alone. Right. And when it comes to like self-care, um, when we get stressed out, even our body begins to ache, right? It affects our posture, all this kind of stuff. So, what I'm saying, and I'm not the expert in this, so I won't say that much. But if we don't take care of this, right, we're gonna fall into dysregulation a lot faster. When we care for both, the body and the mind, or the experience of mind, then we can be in a much more optimal place. Um, you know, the heebie-jeebies part, yeah. I mean, protector practices are really good for this. Yidam practice is also really good, right? When we're able to transform ourselves. Um, and I think it's also really important to look at the technology side behind it. It's kind of like Bob Thurman likes to use this term, you know, sadhana practice and these things as technologies. If we're able to kind of break it apart a little bit and look at what are the important kind of dynamics, then we're able to actually also offer modulated forms of these for people who don't practice Dharma, right? Um, so really, like being as flexible, relaxed, and I think masterly too. I imagine, James, in the work that you do, you will listen to intuition sometimes first and find a specific way of addressing the situation you're being asked to help with in a way that's a little bit of a hybrid, right? A couple different things, right? It's not just usually one thing. And so for each of us to begin to kind of think of ourselves more as instruments through which a kind of healing happens. And I do think, chaplaincy has a healing component to it, but CPE won't say that, right? This is like where this kind of like interesting split happens. But if we can be honed and balanced and harmonized, i.e., tuned in then we'll really be able to provide care in a way where we're caring for the other person and ourselves, and kind of understand the importance of the balance, because anything other than that is really might be well intentioned, but it's not skillful.
So,
Yeah.
I feel like in our medical traditions, and also from earliest Buddhism, may I be the medicine, may I be the nurse and the doctor. And something about Buddhist medicine, I think we are situated in ways, in natural ways, that this tendril or interconnection, if we have just the right skills, the right training, but our presence, sometimes we link up with people we need to and find innovative ways, just the way we are. Um, but I want to, maybe one last gift for those who are listening in a practical way. I bet you forge relationships in your different roles, and we kind of adapt and negotiate change and healing. Um, and one thing I saw from the literature, there was a great quote that said, "Imagine if Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had access to more data."
Yeah.
And it was really about rates of resolution of grief and bereavement. So something that you've probably seen is we heal over time. Amazing how we adapt and transform. But what are some of the ways that you found useful for working with sadness and suffering? Because I think a lot about this has to do with how we relate with pain. And
Mhm.
sometimes pain and loss turns into sadness. So is there anything practical, something from your experience? I'm sure
Yeah.
you worked with sadness with people.
Yeah. Oh no, totally. I think the thing in, sadness, especially in grief experiences, sadness is really, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because it is as if, well, we can say the rate to which we experience sadness has a lot to do with the energy that is put into a relationship, right? And so, for example, in the context of grief, right, if we've been invested in a relationship with somebody for a long 10 years, 20 years, and it's been such an important part of our lives, the absence of that is going to naturally cause pain, isolation, is, sense of confusion, sadness. Uh, so one thing I do tend to share with people is this, just fact, right? I, and maybe say something along the lines of, I never want to feel sadness also. And the only way to never do this is to never feel in the first place. So, right, and it's that love between yourself and the other person that has caused, this beautiful thing to happen. The only way we could not have the sadness would be for it to have never happened in the first place, right? And so using the experience of sadness as a way on many levels of increasing connectivity. When somebody is intimate enough with me or feels intimate enough with me to be able to share how sad they feel, right, that is also a gift to me, like to be able to kind of experience it this way, to so that, okay, let me, we're going to come together very, very closely emotionally on this, and to be able to occupy that very delicate space. In some cases, all that can be done is reflecting back the loss, but in a way that the person is being seen and heard in an intimate way, not just like a non-feeling way, but in this, like, maybe usually in such a way that the other person can pick up on, even the mirror neurons in our own face in responding in a really sensitive and attuned way. So sadness is this way of connecting with others which I'm sure a lot of your listeners have probably had this experience. It, you know, it causes us to draw close, and the other person draws close, but it also brings the person back to the heart of what is making them sad, which is something that's so beautiful and unique and unrecreatable, which is why I'm grieving. And that is so beautiful, you know. The contradictions, you know, it's interesting. Like we work so hard to have no contradictions in in life, but oftentimes it's the contradictions that cause us to have a much deeper relationship to what is actually in our lives than if everything was very easily explained and analyzed.
Perhaps we end on that note, common humanity. It's some of these experiences that many have gone through, bereavement and loss, they're isolating. And I think this psychological construct, common humanity, really is something common also to Buddhist practice. We connect our experience,
Yeah,
share that stuff.
absolutely.
So, Lama Justin, thank you for taking time on this holiday.
Pleasure, James.
I hope this conversation will be beneficial to others.
Absolutely. Me too. Me too. Thank you all. Thank you, James.